If there's no Jeffrey Epstein client list, does his associate Ghislaine Maxwell walk free? Big question has been, well, who exactly did she sex traffic minors to? And after the announcement from the DOJ and FBI, is that a valid legal point? Let's talk about how the recent announcement from the government on Epstein's perceived lack of accomplices may affect the only person who's actually been convicted in connection with Epstein's purported sex crimes ring. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Well, with the shocking news regarding Jeffrey Epstein this week, the conversation has now turned to Ghislaine Maxwell. Okay, and I'm going to explain why. Because as we discussed on a previous sidebar, there was this DOJ FBI memo that was released a few days ago. And it describes how the Department of Justice and the FBI conducted, quote, an exhaustive review of investigative holdings relating to Jeffrey Epstein. How, quote, the FBI conducted digital searches of its databases, hard drives, and network drives, as well as physical searches of squad areas, lock cabinets, desks, closets, and other areas where responsive material may have been stored. These searches uncovered a significant amount of material, including more than 300 gigabytes of data and physical evidence. The files relating to Epstein include a large volume of images of Epstein, images and videos of victims who are either minors or appear to be minors, and over 10,000 downloaded videos and images of illegal child sex abuse material and other pornography. And through that review of digital and documentary evidence, the DOJ, the FBI concluded the following, quote, this systematic review revealed no incriminating client list. There was also no credible evidence found that Epstein blackmailed prominent individuals as part of his actions. We did not uncover evidence that could predicate an investigation against uncharged third parties. That is the section we want to focus on today, because obviously this is big news and surprising news. Surprising news, maybe not even necessarily from an investigative standpoint of what we've learned over the years from different lawsuits, but the perceived stance from the Trump administration and also some of the commentary from high-profile people when it came to the Epstein files. There seemed to be this idea that all of the information and new information would be exposed. Whether that's a fair interpretation or not, that's the conversation. Because in February, President Trump's attorney, Alina Habba, told Piers Morgan there would, quote, be names that will come out. And America needs to remember one thing: we are going to be promises made, promises kept. There was even talk from Attorney General Pam Bondi that complicated the issue, because back in February, she said on Fox News, when asked if she would release, quote, list of Jeffrey Epstein's clients, she responded, it's sitting on my desk right now to review. That's been a directive by President Trump. I'm reviewing that. In March, she said to Fox News host Mark Levin, when he argued that perhaps Democratic officials in New York were not providing all of the Epstein information because they, quote, don't like the names on the list, and that they were, quote, trying to protect a lot of names and individuals, Bondi replied that she had, quote, not reviewed the information yet, but added, I think it's very interesting that they withheld that from us. Now, not trying to get too political here, I'm going to get to the legal point I want to get to when it comes with Ghislaine Maxwell, but White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt seemed to do some damage control, saying the other day that what Bondi was referring to about having the client list on her desk was, quote, she was saying the entirety of all of the paperwork, all of the paper in relation to Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. That's what the Attorney General was referring to. Either way, and aside from the blowback and the criticism and the theories, the main question is that we want to talk about right now: does this affect Jeffrey Epstein's former associate, Ghislaine Maxwell? Remember, she was convicted in December of 2021 in New York federal court of conspiracy to entice minors to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, conspiracy to transport minors to participate in illegal sex acts, transporting a minor to participate in illegal sex acts, sex trafficking conspiracy, and sex trafficking of a minor. And as the government argued, quote, from at least 1994 up to and including in or about 2004, Ghislaine Maxwell assisted, facilitated, and participated in Jeffrey Epstein's abuse of minor girls by, among other things, helping Epstein to recruit, groom, and ultimately abuse victims known to Maxwell and Epstein to be under the age of 18. Here's the thing. If there is no client list, and there's no other criminal defendants, does the case against her make sense? Could she get an argument to overturn her conviction? So for that, let me bring in trial attorney Rich Schoenstein, friend of the show, friend of mine. Good to see you, Rich. Thanks so much for coming on.
Happy to be here, Jesse.
So before we even get into Ghislaine Maxwell, I haven't spoken to you since the news of the week. Your reaction to the memo this week?
Well, I want to focus on some of the language you read because we have to use air quotes. This statement that came out of the Department of Justice says there are no client lists, but it uses quote marks around the term client lists. There are no, the systematic review revealed no incriminating client list. What does that mean? What does that mean? They're not saying we didn't see the names of any people in these files. They're simply saying there wasn't a list, that maybe Jeffrey Epstein didn't maintain a consolidated list of all the people that he brought underage women to, right? He didn't write it down in one place. There is no comprehensive list. But it doesn't mean there weren't names in these files. It doesn't mean there weren't faces on the videos. It doesn't mean there isn't email traffic or other evidence incriminating people. And what I'm reading here says we didn't see a client list, so everybody keep on moving. There's nothing to see here. I think that's sort of a disconnect. That's my reaction to it.
By the way, as we're talking about Ghislaine Maxwell's federal case, you know how in federal courtrooms there's no cameras, there's no recording devices. We talked about in the Sean Combs case. Very frustrating because how great would it have been to have Claude Nopin there? So this tiny wearable AI-powered device completely changes the game. Why? So first of all, I wear mine as a wristband. You could also clip it on, pin it, hang it like a necklace. During law school or early in my legal career, really could have used something like this. Even now as a host, by the way, it's a total cheat code. Why? So whether it's meetings, interviews, quick brainstorms, the Notepin catches everything. It transcribes in 112 languages. It automatically tags speakers, and it drops everything into this clean, digestible summary. There's no more messy notes or lost ideas. It's not just a recorder, by the way. It actually acts like a hands-free assistant, pulling insights, organizing information, and letting you stay fully in the moment. So if you want to make the most of your time, it's time to try the Claude Notepin. Right now, you can get 10% off. Just click the link below or scan the QR code on screen. Hope you can check it out. Yeah, well, again, they also said there was no blackmailing and we didn't uncover evidence that could predicate an investigation against uncharged third parties. They're basically saying it was Epstein and Maxwell alone. And when you hear that, that's the part where I hear you. There might be no consolidated list that he kept in his bedside drawer. But, you know, the idea basically what they're saying is there's no other people to charge at this time or to investigate. And what's interesting is this is the commentary we've been getting. You get comments from Elon Musk posting on X. What's the time? Oh, look, it's no one has been arrested o'clock again. And remember, he famously accused Trump not too long ago of being on the Epstein list. There was conservative activist Laura Loomer who wrote on X, if she doesn't get fired over this Epstein memo, people are going to be so black-pilled. You have influencer Liz Wheeler, who said on the Glenn Beck show, contextualizing all of this, this seems like unforgivable behavior. So the question becomes, you know, aren't they trying to close the door on investigating anybody else connected with Jeffrey Epstein? Aren't they saying there is no one else?
I think that is what they're saying. Now, so Elon Musk is wrong when he says no one was arrested, right? Because Jeffrey Epstein was arrested. Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested. So it's not nobody was arrested. There may be other people here, but, you know, think about this historically. We don't tend to go after the Johns. We don't tend to go after the people who pay the prostitutes or get the services of sex workers. We tend to go after the workers and the people who facilitate that and the sex traffickers. So the government could be saying, we know there were other people involved, but we're not going to prosecute them because that's not the way we expend our resources. That's not quite the way they're saying it. They're really trying to say more, you know, we don't have enough evidence to charge anybody else. I'm a little skeptical about that, to tell you the truth.
Well, now I have to get to the main aspect of this, because this has come up a lot now. So the question now is, does this affect Ghislaine Maxwell? Because how many times have people already made the argument, well, wait a second, she was convicted of sex trafficking, but sex trafficking these victims to who? In other words, if the government is coming out and saying now that there are no other clients, then does it make sense that she was convicted of essentially operating this extensive sex trafficking operation? Let me add a little bit more context to this. You have a political activist named Jack Posevich, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing his name, wrote on X, if there were no clients, why is Ghislaine Maxwell still in jail? You had podcasters, the Hodge twins, who wrote, Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison for 20 years for sex trafficking kids with Epstein, and the DOJ and FBI just said that there's no client list. He didn't blackmail nobody, and nobody else is getting charged, so they sex traffic kids to nobody? And then you tell me, are those fair criticisms, or is this a misunderstanding of what the criminal trial against Ghislaine Maxwell was about?
I think it's a misunderstanding of what the trial was about, and it's a misunderstanding about how the criminal justice process works. So let me break that down a little bit. She was convicted of sex trafficking based on evidence presented in a month-long trial in court. And apparently that evidence didn't include a client list, because we've never seen a client list. We're now told there is no client list. So it wasn't amongst the evidence that was used against her. She could have sex trafficked only to herself and to Jeffrey Epstein. If the evidence was that she brought underage girls to have sexual relations with Epstein and or with her, that would be enough. You don't need any clients. You don't need anybody else. That is still sex trafficking, and she could have been convicted for that fairly and squarely. So I don't think any client list was necessary to her prosecution, but it wasn't part of her prosecution. And so here's the procedure point I want to bring up. If you are convicted of a crime, you can appeal based on mistakes that happened in the trial, errors of law, the judge did something wrong, the jury did something wrong. You can appeal on that basis. Occasionally, you can seek to overturn a conviction based on newly found evidence. If there's evidence that comes out that all of a sudden demonstrates you're not guilty or points the finger at somebody else, there are mechanisms to go back to court and say, I was wrongly convicted. But that's not this case. You can't go back to court to overturn a conviction because you find out there's evidence that doesn't exist, right? What's the argument?
I guess the argument, if the elements were that she sex trafficked to multiple people, including Epstein, then I think they would have an argument, right? But if the element of a charge was it has to be she sex trafficked these individuals to multiple people, then I think they have an argument. But look, let me read you the specific language. So this is some of the specific language that was used by the prosecution. And when I say specific, I mean, this was very, very deliberate how they said it. So the victims were as young as 14 years old when they were groomed and abused by Maxwell and Epstein. Okay, no one else, both of whom knew that their victims were in fact minors. As a part and in furtherance of their scheme to abuse minor victims, Maxwell and Epstein enticed and caused minor victims to travel to Epstein's residences in different states, which Maxwell knew and intended would result in their grooming for and subjection to sexual abuse. As Maxwell and Epstein intended, these grooming behaviors left minor victims vulnerable and susceptible to sexual abuse by Epstein, period. That was it, only person. Maxwell was then present for certain sexual encounters between minor victims and Epstein, such as interactions where a minor victim was undressed and ultimately was present for sex acts perpetrated by Epstein on minor victims. That's deliberate language right there. They weren't trying to make this a bigger case than it was.
That's right. And that's exactly what I said. This is about trafficking to Epstein and Maxwell, not to anybody else. There's no allegation in what you just read about other clients, and therefore there's no allegation about a client list, and therefore the existence or non-existence of a client list is completely irrelevant to her prosecution and her conviction. The claim in her case was that she trafficked minors who were abused by herself and by Epstein. Evidence was presented to that jury, which they credited and convicted her of. I don't see any way that's getting overturned just based on this latest announcement.
You know, there are people might look at it and say, wait a minute. There's no way she could have done it herself. In fact, during her trial, I believe Juan Alessi, who was a house manager, had testified that she directed him, Epstein and her directed him to contact and pick up girls for these massages. So somebody will look at the news and say, again, I don't understand this. How could she operate this sex trafficking operation alone? And maybe and again, I'm just playing devil's advocate, could the defense say, well, wait a second, if this news came out before the trial, we would have made the argument, there's no way that one woman could have done all this on her own. The government's case falls apart. We would have presented that defense, and particularly if the government comes out and says there's no third parties. Is that a stretch?
Yeah, I mean, you could have made that, you could have presented that defense anyway. By the way, I don't think that vindicates her to say that there were other people involved. There are loads of cases where one of the conspirators gets tried and convicted and others don't for various reasons. Sometimes because they turn evidence, sometimes because the cases against them aren't that important or isn't that compelling, and sometimes because they're not the focus of the prosecution. Prosecutors tend to go for the top, the heads of the criminal misconduct. So here They went after Epstein and they went after Maxwell. And they may not have gone after everybody who had some participatory role. That doesn't exonerate her. That's not enough to do it.
Yeah, look at the Sean Combs case, right? He was charged with sex trafficking, and he was, I don't even know if I want to use the word almost, but there was a potential that he was going to be convicted of that as the only person who allegedly sex trafficked Cassie and Jane. So it's not outside the realm of possibility. Like you said, I think you laid it out very well, that she could be the only person who was brought up on sex trafficking charges that was actually went to a resolution, she was convicted, and sex trafficking of these victims to Jeffrey Epstein as the sole person. Now, you're a great litigator. How could I not ask you about the lawsuits, okay? So let's talk about this. Through litigation, what have we seen over the years? A lot of accusations. Prince Andrew was accused of sexual assault. He settled a civil lawsuit against him. He's always denied the claims, though. You had famed Epstein accuser Virginia Giuffre, who tragically died in April, who claims that she was forced to have sex with New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson, billionaire hedge fund manager Glenn Dubin, French model scout Jean-Luc Brunel. She also famously accused lawyer Alan Dershowitz as being one of the men that Epstein had pimped her out to. Not only, by the way, has he adamantly denied those allegations each and every time, but Giuffre actually dropped her own lawsuit against him a few years ago. The question now is, based on what the government just said, is all of that meaningless? And what do I mean by that? Is there no merit based on this announcement? Do we say none of this can be true? There is no list. It means that there were no other people, there were no other alleged abusers, there was no one else that was involved. Is that interpretation we have to make?
No, I don't think so, for two reasons. One is we go back to the age-old discussion that a prosecutor's burden of proof is much higher than in civil court. So it may be that the prosecutors don't believe there's adequate evidence to go after any other people, but a civil litigant, especially a civil litigant who claims they were personally abused, thinks there is adequate evidence to go forward in a court. And if there's a civil litigant who is going to say, this person, I was trafficked to this person and they abused me, then they're still going to have a claim. And again, the fact that there is no client list, if that is true, by the way, the fact that there is no list doesn't mean there were no clients. I mean, if you were running a business of transporting underage women to clients, you might not want to write down their names. You might think, you might have been prescient and thought it would be a bad idea to write down their names. So there is no client list. But is there other evidence? Are there communications? Do we have records of travel? Do we have photographs of people? Do we have testimony that I was sent to this person on this date and he or she abused me. All of that evidence is still in the realm of possibility, and civil suits will go forward, and eventually they'll be confronted with, is there enough evidence there to go to trial? And if they do go to trial, is there enough evidence to convince a jury? But at least at the outset, I think those suits can go forward, even if the government says there's not enough here to prosecute.
In other words, that's the key there. You've seen cases before where the prosecutors will say, yeah, there's not enough evidence to go forward with a charge here. Okay, we don't believe that we can make the case for a variety of reasons, but that does not preclude someone from filing a lawsuit against that individual under the same set of facts, the same set of circumstances. And by the way, how many times have we seen a case where somebody is found not guilty at a trial and yet they could be found liable or at least sued in a civil context? So that's the way you're basically saying we should be thinking about this right now. Despite the conclusion of the government, a civil case can practically go forward and may even be successful because we're talking about a totally different area of law.
Right. And we're seeing two examples of that right now. Karen Reed was just acquitted, but there's civil litigation against her that will proceed. Sean Combs, you mentioned a few minutes ago, he was just acquitted, but there are dozens of civil cases that I expect to proceed against him anyway. Being found not guilty or not having been prosecuted does not immunize you from civil litigation.
You said if there's no client list. What do you think was going on here? Do you believe that they did a thorough review of all of the material as they documented, and they come back and they say, first of all, we're not going to release half of this because we're not going to release pretty much all of it because it would just further exploit the victims in this case. There is no benefit to releasing this material. We went through it. As the interpretation, everything we saw was Jeffrey Epstein on those tapes with these minor victims, no one else. Because to come out with this statement, it's not like they had a deadline. It's not like they had to come out on that Monday and be like, all right, we're coming up with a decision where you have to. They released a statement that it seemed like they would hope would end the conversation. It clearly has not. What do you think was the rationale behind the federal government coming forward and saying there's no client list, there's no blackmail? By the way, Jeffrey Epstein was not killed. They also concluded that as well. No other third parties basically are going to be investigated. What do you think the motivation was?
So, I think the motivation is to put the issue to bed. And I find myself a little conflicted here. I mean, you and I know each other pretty well, and I'm not a conspiracy theory guy.
Correct.
I don't buy most of the conspiracy theories. And you went over some names of some people who have been commenting about this and criticizing and questioning it. And they're not people that I ordinarily agree with on this kind of thing. But I do have to say, it's a little fishy, right? Pam Bondi said the list was on her desk. She said there was a list on her desk. And now a couple months later, we get an announcement that there is no list. I mean, that's just fishy. That's just not consistent. So I have questions about that. I've said, as I've explained, I have questions about what they mean by quote unquote client list and what other evidence may be there. I am sort of sympathetic to the idea that you don't want to release victim names to further harm them. I get that. And I kind of get the idea that you don't want to just start releasing names if there's not clear evidence of misconduct, because you don't want to cast aspersions no matter whose name appears there. I get that. But I do have questions about this. I think it's an effort by the DOJ to put this to bed, to put this, Maxwell is convicted, Epstein is dead, and they're saying there is nobody else to prosecute, so this is over, and they want to put it to bed. But in trying to do so, they have raised some questions, I think some fair questions.
Do you think there's any possibility an investigation could be restarted, and what would that look like? What would cause that? Is it a change in leadership at the DOJ? I mean, I don't want to even, it's not a political show, but I am curious. Is it really put to bed? I mean, you could look at it and say, okay, They said there's nothing there. Maybe Pam Bondi misspoke about what was really on her desk. Maybe she was using a euphemism or something like that. She really wasn't referring to a client list. If you could take that interpretation, or you could say something's still there. It's going to take something to reignite this investigation. I don't know whether it's a lawsuit, whether it's an investigative documentary, whether it's news reporting, whatever it might be, whether it's a change at the DOJ. Do you think there's a possibility that this is not the end of the story? And that, again, I don't know if there's other people connected to Jeffrey Epstein. I have no idea. But do you think this is really the end of the story?
So, I don't know. And I take your point, we're not doing a political show here, so I'm going to go soft. But the DOJ is supposed to represent America. It's not supposed to change based on what political party is in office. They're supposed to prosecute cases as they see fit to prosecute, regardless of political influence. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of political influence in the last year. We just have. So the DOJ is being guided by politics, which may or may not have something to do with this. One of the problems when you guide the DOJ for political reasons is then you put into question everything the DOJ does. This may be a purely legitimate decision of the DOJ not to prosecute something, and we're all thinking about politics because we know there's been political influences on the DOJ. It really mucks it up. So could a change in leadership change the approach? I imagine. Also, there's still state prosecutors. Also, there's still civil litigation, as we discussed. So I don't think the issue is dead. I think just the idea that the DOJ was going to come out with a list of names and prosecute people, that for the moment is dead.
Richard Schoenstein, great seeing you. Thanks so much for taking the time. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.